The soldier's heart stopped at 11:47 p.m. Three doctors stood frozen at the doorway of Trauma Bay 2, staring at a flat line that none of them were willing to touch. The patient was classified. The paperwork hadn't cleared. The chief surgeon said, "Wait," so they waited, while a decorated Navy combat diver lay dying on a gurney with two shattered ribs puncturing the space where his left lung used to be. Only one person in Harwich Military Medical Center moved. She wasn't supposed to be in that room. She wasn't even supposed to be on that floor. By the time the monitors started beeping again, the chief surgeon was already on the phone with administration. Not to report the save, to report the nurse. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one don't come along every week. This channel is where real drama lives, the kind of story that makes you grip your armrest and forget to breathe. Once you're subscribed, tap the like button so more people find us, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The rain had been hammering Harwich, Virginia for 6 hours straight by the time the military transport pulled into the emergency bay of Harwich Military Medical Center. It wasn't the kind of rain that eased up. It was the kind that made the highway invisible and turned the drainage ditches along Route 9 into small rivers. The kind that made even seasoned EMTs grip their steering wheels tighter than usual. Kind of rain that felt like a warning. Nurse Mara Doyle heard the bay doors slam open from the third-floor supply corridor where she was restocking compression bandages at 11:31 p.m. She'd been on shift since 3 in the afternoon. Her sneakers were still damp from the parking lot puddle she'd stepped in at the start of her shift, and the back of her neck carried the particular tension that set in after hour 6 of 12-hour rotation, that low, grinding ache that no amount of coffee quite touched. She leaned over the railing and watched the gurney come in fast. Except too fast. The two medics punching it weren't the regular contracted transport team. They wore gray fatigues. She didn't recognize no hospital ID, lanyards, no civilian contractor badges. One of them was holding a manual pressure cuff against the patient's upper arm with both hands, the kind of grip that meant the automated system had already failed. The other was talking into a radio in a voice too low to carry. Mara's eyes dropped to the patient's face. Mid-30s. White male. Strong jaw gone slack. The kind of muscle structure that didn't come from a gym, it came from years of carrying weight over bad terrain. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, pale and old, the kind you come stopped in years ago. His lips had taken on the gray-blue tinge she associated with one specific clinical scenario, and it wasn't good. She was already moving down the stairs before she consciously decided to. Trauma Bay 2 was the designated military intake room, separate access, separate documentation, theoretically separate staff. In practice, it shared a wall with the main ER and pulled from the same nursing roster when things got busy. At 11:33 p.m. on a Tuesday, it was staffed by two residents who had been on for 22 hours and a traveling nurse named Gorman who transferred in from a cardiac facility in Ohio and had, by his own cheerful admission, almost no trauma experience. Mara pushed through the bay doors just as Dr. Philip Osterhaus arrived from the far end of the corridor. Osterhaus was the attending chief of trauma surgery at Harwich, a tall man with a deliberate walk and the specific kind of confidence that came from 30 years of being the smartest person in whatever room he entered. He was 61 years old. He'd published 47 peer-reviewed papers. He had a plaque in the lobby and a parking spot with his name stenciled on it, and he expected to be treated with equal reverence. He looked at Mara like she'd tracked mud onto a clean floor. Doyle, his voice was flat. This is a restricted intake. I know, she said. She was already looking at the patient's chart display, the partial readout the transport medics had clipped to the gurney rail. Who cleared his airway en route? One of the gray uniform medics glanced up. He was breathing on arrival to the transport vehicle. BP was, "That's not what I asked." She pulled the chart free, which made Osterhaus take a sharp breath through his nose. Was his airway cleared before transport? Or did he go lateral on his own during the ride? Doyle, his lips are cyanotic. She said it without drama, the way you'd report a temperature reading. He's got asymmetrical chest rise. That scar on his left side, she pointed to a mark along the patient's lateral ribcage, partially obscured by his shredded field shirt. That's not from the explosion. That's at least 2 weeks old, which means his left lung has been compromised longer than tonight. The room went quiet for a second too long. Osterhaus's jaw tightened. What you're describing is speculative. We don't have imaging minence. We don't need imaging to see that he's not moving air on the left side. She looked at resident doctor, Yusuf Okafor, who was standing at the secondary monitor, with the expression of a man who desperately wanted someone else to make the next decision. Yusuf, listen to him. Okafor looked at Osterhaus. Osterhaus said nothing. Okafor picked up the stethoscope. He listened for 4 seconds, and then straightened up and said, very quietly, she's right. Left side is almost silent. Osterhaus set his clipboard down on the supply tray with a careful, controlled click. I'll be performing the assessment, Dr. Okafor. That is my role as attending. Nurse Doyle, he turned, and there was something in his face now that wasn't just irritation. You are not assigned to this bay. You are not cleared for this patient's file under the military intake protocol. I need you to leave now. If you wait for the full assessment protocol, he arrests, Mara said. That is not your determination to make. Then make it. Right now, she held his gaze. Her voice didn't rise. Mara Doyle had spent 4 years in situations where raising your voice was a luxury nobody could afford. And old habits didn't disappear just because you traded your uniform for scrubs. Because in approximately 3 minutes, you won't have a patient to assess. The monitors screamed. Not a warning tone, the full cardiac alarm. The one that cut through the ambient noise of every machine in the room and made Gorman, the traveling nurse, physically flinch backward. Patient's BP had dropped off the display entirely. The rhythm on the screen was nothing recognizable, not VFib, not VTAC, just the kind of chaotic electrical garbage that preceded a system shutting down. Osterhaus moved, but Mara moved faster. She was at the head of the gurney, before the crash cart cleared the corner, her hands already positioning for a jaw thrust, not a chin tilt, a jaw thrust. The distinction mattering because cervical injury hadn't been ruled out and a chin tilt on an unstable spine was the kind of shortcut that trading a cardiac emergency for a neurological catastrophe. She suctioned manually with the handheld unit from her scrub pocket. She'd been carrying one since her 2nd year as a medic, a habit that exactly 0 of her nursing supervisors had ever understood, and got a partial airway lining that bought maybe 90 seconds. I need a 14-gauge needle. 2nd intercostal space, midclavicular line, left side, she said. Tension pneumo. If I'm wrong, we lose nothing. If I'm right, and we don't go now, you are not authorized to perform. Osterhaus began. Then you do it. She stepped back 1 step and looked at him directly. Not challenging. Not performing. Just clear. Right now. You do it. Something shifted in the room. Okafor had already pulled a needle from the cart. Gorman was on the phone. Mara couldn't hear who he'd called. One of the gray uniform transport ex-medics had moved closer to the gurney and was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Osterhaus took the needle from Okafor. He hesitated for 1 second that Mara counted because she was watching the patient's face and that second was visible. And then he performed the decompression. The sound was unmistakable. A soft, pressurized exhale, the kind that meant she'd been right. The monitors shifted. Not to normal, not yet, but away from the edge. The patient's color changed fractionally at the mouth. Matte, the blue-gray pulling back a degree toward something that could be worked with. Osterhaus straightened and looked at Mara with an expression that contained so many things, at once relief and fury, and something she thought might actually be fear, that she couldn't isolate which one was driving him. Get her out of this room, he said. He said it to no one in particular, which meant he was saying it to everyone. Now, she let them move her to the corridor. She didn't fight it. She'd done what needed to happen, and fighting the exit was not going to help the patient, who still needed a chest tube and a surgical consult, and about 6 things she was no longer in a position to provide. The doors swung shut behind her. She stood in the corridor, outside Trauma Bay 2 at 11:51 p.m., her back against the wall, listening to the muffled sound of the team stabilizing a man whose name she didn't know. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about training it didn't leave. You could set it down for years. It was still there. The same muscle memory, the same pattern recognition, the same ability to look at a deteriorating situation and see exactly what it needed. She'd set it down 6 years ago, and she still hadn't figured out why she thought that was going to work. Suspension came at 6:14 a.m. Mara was finishing her charting at the 3rd floor nursing station. She'd been placed back on her regular rotation after being removed from the trauma bay, as though nothing had happened when Patricia Holst, the director of nursing operations, appeared at the end of the corridor. Holst was a compact woman in her early 50s who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades delivering bad news and had long since made her peace with it. She walked with her keycard, lanyard held against her chest, which Mara had noticed was something she did when she was uncomfortable. "Conference room," Holst said. No greeting, no preamble. Mara saved her notes and followed. Conference room on the administrative floor smelled like the same carpet cleaner. It always smelled like, and it was occupied by Holst, a HR coordinator named Dev Brannigan, who Mara had spoken to exactly once before, and which surprised her director Gerald Rusk. Rusk ran the entire Harwick facility. He attended these meetings the way a judge attended traffic court, only when the situation had already escalated, beyond the appropriate venue. He was a man who looked like he'd been built for the specific purpose of sitting at the head of tables. Late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of permanent tan that came from outdoor golf rather than a beach vacation. He had a folder open in front of him that Mara could see contained a stack of printed documents, and he'd been reading them before they walked in because the papers still had the slight bend of recent handling. "Nurse Doyle," Rusk said, "sit down." She sat. "I'm going to be straightforward with you." He closed the folder. "What happened last night in Trauma Bay 2 constitutes a serious breach of this facility's protocols. You entered a restricted intake without authorization. You interfered with the attending physician's assessment process, and you performed," he glanced at the folder, "or directed the performance of an emergency procedure without proper cleared authority. The patient was in cardiac arrest," Mara said. "That determination was Dr. Osterhaus's to make." Dr. Osterhaus was in the doorway when the alarm sounded. Rusk's expression didn't change. "I'm not going to debate the sequence of events with you. I'm telling you what the record shows. The record shows an unauthorized staff member entered a restricted military intake bay, circumvented the attending's process, and in Dr. Osterhaus's documented assessment, created an environment of confusion that compromised the team's ability to respond efficiently." Mara looked at Rusk for a long moment. Then she looked at Holst, who was looking at the table. Then at Brannigan, who was looking at his hands. "The patient lived," she said. "Patient's outcome is not the metric being discussed here." She almost said something. She felt the words form, and then she let them go. Because she had been in rooms like this one, before different rooms. Different institutions, the same architecture of decision. And she knew that the words wouldn't change anything. The outcome was already in the folder. The folder had already been prepared before she walked through the door. "Effective immediately," Rusk said, "your employment with Harwick Military Medical Center is suspended pending review. Given the severity of the breach and the classified nature of the intake in question, HR will be in contact regarding the terms of that review." He paused. "You're to surrender your badge and building access before leaving the facility today." Mara placed her keycard on the table. She stood up. "The man in Trauma Bay 2 had a tension pneumothorax complicated by a pre-existing pleural injury," she said. "It's in his presentation, if anyone looks at the lateral scar. Somebody should look at it." She picked up her bag from the floor. "Before they do anything else to him." She walked out. In the elevator down to the ground floor, she stood very still and stared at the brushed metal panel with its glowing floor buttons And she did not let herself think about anything specific because specific thoughts had a way of becoming emotional events. And she was not ready for that yet. She'd learned to compartmentalize the way some people learned a language, not naturally, but with enough repetition that it eventually became fluent. The rain had stopped. The parking lot was wet and gray and smelled like wet asphalt, and Mara sat in her car for 4 minutes before starting the engine. Then she drove home. She lived in a rented duplex on the eastern edge of Harwich, a mid-sized military city that existed primarily because of the base and the 2 facilities it supported, and had the functional architecture of every such city: chain motels, a VFW hall, strip of restaurants that catered to people eating alone. The duplex had a narrow kitchen and a living room that she'd filled with the kind of furniture you bought when you weren't sure how long you were staying somewhere, which for Mara had become the way she furnished everywhere. She made coffee. She didn't drink it. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and stared at the condensation ring from a glass she'd left there 2 days ago. She had been fired before, not from a hospital, from a different kind of job, in a different kind of setting, and for reasons that overlapped in uncomfortable ways with the current situation. That was the part she wasn't thinking about specifically. Her phone buzzed at 8:45 a.m. Unknown number. She answered it because she almost always answered unknown numbers' old habit. Mara Doyle? The voice was male, mid-40s, measured in the way of someone who chose words deliberately. Yes. My name is not something I'm going to give you on an open line. I need you to know that the man you helped stabilize last night is alive. And I need you to know that certain people are aware you were the one who identified the pneumothorax presentation. Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car drove past too fast, spraying residual rain from the gutter. Who are you? Right now, I'm just a person telling you not to go anywhere for a few days. I lost my job this morning. I know, the voice said. That's why I'm calling. A pause. Don't sign anything they send you. Don't respond to any official communication from Harwick's legal office without reading it 3 times. And if anyone from the facility contacts you requesting information about what you observed during that intake, write down every word they say and the exact time they said it. The line went quiet. What's the patient's name? Mara asked. Call disconnected. She set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she picked up her coffee, discovered it had gone cold, and went to the counter to pour it out. The next 36 hours were the specific kind of quiet that Mara associated with waiting, which she was bad at. She'd always been bad at it. Waiting required a relationship with uncertainty that she'd never managed to develop. She was better with action, with problems that had identifiable components and workable solutions. Sitting in her duplex while the hours accumulated was something she endured rather than managed. Cleaned the kitchen. She reorganized the bathroom cabinet. She ran 4 miles on the bike path along the river, even though the path was still wet and her left knee, which had been a recurring issue for 3 years, ached through the last mile in a way that she chose to ignore. She pulled up Harwich Military Medical Center's staff directory on her laptop and looked at it for a while, without doing anything specific with it. She thought about the patient's face. The gray blue at the lips. The old scar along the lateral rib cage, the one she'd pointed out, and that she was fairly certain no one had followed up on, because if they had, someone would have had questions that hadn't been asked yet. On the second afternoon, Holst called her. Official call. Not a person. Mara could hear the formality in her voice, the way you could hear a script underneath someone's words. I'm calling to inform you that your suspension has been formally escalated to termination, Holst said. HR will send the documentation by courier today. The terms include Pat. Mara used the first name deliberately. They'd worked together for 2 years. It wasn't close, but it wasn't nothing. Does the termination documentation mention the patient? A beat. No. Does it mention the specific nature of the breach? Another beat. Longer. It cites unauthorized entry to a restricted intake and interference with attending protocol. Does it mention that the patient survived? Holst said nothing for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was exactly the same. The script exactly the same, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, a flatness that might have been discomfort. The documentation will arrive by end of day. You have 14 days to respond. Call ended. Mara sat with that for a minute. Then she went and got a pen and a yellow legal pad. She had 5 of them in a drawer, because she'd always thought better on paper than on screen. And she started writing down everything she remembered about Trauma Bay 2. Every observation, every word said by every person, every timestamp she could recall. She had a good memory, better than average, trained by circumstances. And she worked her way through the entire sequence twice, checking the second pass against the first for anything she'd varied. The old scar, the gray uniform medics who weren't hospital contractors. The way Osterhaus had hesitated that one visible second before performing the decompression. The way the transport medic had watched her with the unreadable expression. She wrote it all down. She was on the 3rd page when her phone buzzed again. Different unknown number. She answered. Ms. Doyle. This is Special Agent Renata Voss, Military Criminal Investigative Service. The voice was a woman's direct, efficient, the cadence of someone who covered ground quickly and expected the same of whoever she was speaking with. I need to speak with you in person. Today, if possible. Mara looked at her legal pad. About the patient from Trauma Bay 2. About several things, Voss said. Can you be at the Harwick Federal Building at 1,600 hours? Yes, Mara said. She was already circling something she'd written on the 3rd page. The lateral scar. Pre-existing pleural injury. Minimum 2 weeks old. Explosion that had supposedly caused the patient's injuries had occurred 4 days ago. The Harwick Federal Building was on the corner of Talbot and 7th, a squat, aggressively functional structure that existed primarily to house the regional offices of various agencies that didn't advertise their presence. The lobby had a security desk, a metal detector, and a bored-looking man in a blue uniform who processed Mara's ID with the same energy as someone scanning groceries. Renata Voss met her in a second-floor conference room. She was 38 or so, with the kind of dark hair that went into a bun without being arranged, wearing a civilian blazer over a collared shirt. She had a legal pad of her own yellow, same brand as Mara's, which Mara noticed and said nothing about, and a manila folder that she placed on the table but didn't immediately open. Across the table from Voss sat a man in army dress uniform who introduced himself only as Colonel Tate. He was perhaps 55, lean, with the specific economy of movement of someone who had learned long ago that stillness communicated authority more effectively than activity. They shook hands. They sat down. Commander Darian Ashworth, Voss said. That's the patient's name. He's currently in the ICU at a secure military medical facility. He was transferred from Harwick at 400 this morning. Mara filed that. How is he? Stable. Which, from what we understand, is a more positive outcome than was likely without your intervention. I want to understand something, Mara said. Why is MCIS involved in a trauma intake? Voss and Tate exchanged a look that wasn't quite quick enough to be subtle. Commander Ashworth is a member of a Naval Special Operations Unit currently involved in an active classified operation, Voss said. The incident that resulted in his injuries is under investigation. The incident being the explosion. The reported explosion, Tate said. It was the first thing he'd said, and the way he said reported dropped into the room with deliberate weight. Mara looked at him. The lateral scar. His expression shifted fractionally. You noticed it. First minute. Pre-existing pleural compromise, minimum 2 weeks prior to the reported incident date, which means either the explosion aggravated a prior injury that was undisclosed in his file, or the mechanism of his injuries isn't what the intake documentation says it is. Voss leaned forward slightly. Ms. Doyle, we need to ask you some questions about your background. She opened the manila folder, specifically about your service record. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a city bus went past on Talbot Street. Mara could hear the specific hydraulic sigh of its doors at a stop. I was a combat medic, Mara said. Army, 4 deployments. I left the service 8 years ago. You left following an internal review. Voss said. Not a question. Following a complaint I filed. Yes. A complaint about procurement irregularities in your unit's medical supply chain. A complaint about a contractor who was delivering compromised equipment to forward medical teams. She'd said it in every official context, where she'd been required to say it flat, precise, without the accompanying anger that still lived underneath it. Equipment that failed under operational conditions. I documented it. I filed the complaint through proper channels. Complaint was reviewed and classified, and the contractor's contract was renewed. Tate was watching her with focused attention. 2 months later, I was separated, Mara said. The official reason was force reduction. I've always considered that characterization creative. Voss made a note. The contractor, she said, Meridian Logistics Group. Something went still in Mara's chest. It was not a reaction she displayed. But it was there, the recognition, the particular cold clarity of a name from 8 years ago appearing in a second-floor conference room in Harwick. Virginia, connected to a man with a pre-existing pleural injury and a classified operation, and a chest that had been shutting down on a gurney while 3 doctors stood in a doorway. Yes, she said carefully. Meridian Logistics Group. Voss and Tate exchanged another look. This one wasn't subtle at all. Commander Ashworth, Tate said, regained consciousness at approximately 800 this morning. He was lucid for 11 minutes before being sedated for a procedure. In those 11 minutes, he communicated a number of things to the medical staff and the duty officer present. He paused. One of those things was a description of the nurse, who he said kept him alive in the trauma bay. He asked that she be located. Mara waited. He also said one other thing, Voss said. She looked down at her folder, then back up. He said he had documentation of active operations by Meridian Logistics in a current theater. Documentation that he had encrypted and distributed before he was transported. And he said, she paused, choosing the words carefully, that he'd been given a sedative compound 3 days before the explosion. Something that would have made the injury to his lung look incidental rather than deliberate. The city bus sighed at another stop, somewhere further down Talbot now. Someone tried to make sure he didn't survive the transport, Mara said. We believe so, Voss said, and the same contractor that compromised medical equipment for forward units 8 years ago is connected to whatever Ashworth was investigating. That's what we're working to confirm. Mara looked at her legal pad, which she'd brought, and which sat on the table in front of her 3 pages of time-stamped observations from Trauma Bay 2, written in the small, dense handwriting that she defaulted to when she was working fast. Dr. Osterhaus, she said. He knew what was in that patient's file before he walked into the bay. He knew, and he wanted the team to wait. The silence in the room confirmed it without anyone saying a word. Mara flipped to the 3rd page of her notes and pushed them across the table toward Voss. I wrote down everything I observed during the intake, she said. Timestamps, personnel, sequence of decisions. The information about the scar and the pre-existing injury is on page 3. She kept her voice level. I've been fired this afternoon, officially for unauthorized entry to a restricted intake and interference with attending protocol. Tate picked up the legal pad and read. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. One more question, Mara said. The 2 medics who transported Ashworth. The gray uniforms, no hospital, contractor ID. Who were they? Voss looked at her for a long moment. That, she said, is actually one of the things we were hoping you could help us answer. Mara pulled the legal pad back, flipped to a fresh page, and picked up her pen. Outside, the bus was gone. The street was quiet. The afternoon light through the window was pale and flat, the way it got in this part of Virginia in late autumn, and it fell across the table and the open folder and the yellow pages in a way that made everything look very clear and very ordinary, which was how the least ordinary situations usually appeared. Right up until they didn't. Then let's start from the beginning, she said. They started from the beginning. Voss worked through it methodically, the kind of interview structure that moved in careful increments, never jumping, never pushing too hard, giving each detail room to breathe before moving to the next one. Mara had been on the other side of that structure before, in different rooms with different questioners, and she understood it for what it was, not conversation, but excavation. The goal was to surface things the subject didn't know they remembered. She walked them through the entire intake sequence, again, not just the medical elements this time, but the texture of it. The way the gray uniform medics had moved, the angle from which they'd entered the bay, whether they'd made eye contact with Osterhaus or avoided it, the radio which the medic had held it in, whether the communication was ongoing or concluded when they arrived. Tate wrote. Voss listened with the focused stillness of someone cataloging rather than simply hearing. By the time they finished, the window had darkened, and someone had turned on the overhead fluorescence without Mara noticing the transition. She looked up at the light and realized it was past 6. The radio the medic was using, Tate said, reviewing his notes. You said it wasn't standard military issue. The housing was wrong. The antenna was shorter than the tactical units I was familiar with. It looked commercial, the kind of thing you could source privately. She paused. Which doesn't mean anything on its own, but combined with the fact that neither of them had any facility credentials and their uniforms didn't match any contractor designation I recognized. They didn't match because they weren't contractors, Voss said, closed her folder. It was the first time she'd made that kind of direct statement, and it landed differently than her careful questions had. We're working to identify them. The transport vehicle was registered to a shell company with a Meridian subsidiary 3 steps back in the corporate structure. Mara looked at her. So they drove him into a hospital where the chief of trauma surgery is on our list, Tate said quietly. We can't say more than that right now. She nodded. She sat with it for a moment, the specific weight of being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. That. What do you need from me? She said. Voss and Tate exchanged their third look of the meeting. This one was longer, and Mara had the impression it concluded something they'd already discussed before. Head her up. Right now, Voss said, we need you to do nothing that looks unusual. The termination from Harwick, let it process. Don't contest it publicly. Don't speak to media. Don't contact anyone at the facility. She paused. And we need you to be reachable. That's the primary thing. Think they'll come after me, Mara said. We think that if the people involved in Ashworth's situation know that a nurse with a military medical background identified the plural discrepancy and is now sitting in a federal building answering questions. Voss stopped. We'd rather you not be isolated. It was a careful way to say what it was actually saying. Mara understood that. She walked out of the federal building at 6:23 p.m. into an evening that had turned cold. The wet asphalt smell of the morning had given way to something drier. The temperature drop, sharp enough to make her exhale visible. She sat in her car for a moment with the engine off. She thought about Commander Darian Ashworth in an ICU, somewhere, sedated, alive by margins she could calculate precisely. She thought about Meridian Logistics Group, a classified complaint she'd filed 8 years ago, and a contractor whose contract had been renewed anyway. She thought about the way Osterhaus had hesitated that 1 second before he decompressed Ashworth's chest. She started the engine and drove home and made herself eat something real, which took effort, because when she was running on adrenaline and cognitive load, her appetite disappeared entirely. She managed half a plate of rice and leftover chicken that she'd cooked 3 days ago and hadn't touched since. And then she sat at the kitchen table with her legal pad and kept writing. She wrote until midnight. Then she went to bed, which was not the same as sleeping. Courier from Harwick's HR office arrived at 9 the next morning with a sealed envelope containing 11 pages. Smar sat at the kitchen table and read all 11 pages 3 times, as she'd been told to do, and made notes in the margin with a red pen. The termination documentation was thorough. Whoever had drafted it had been careful to construct the breach narrative in a way that isolated Mara's actions from the outcome, so that the record read as a series of protocol violations without any reference to what those violations had preceded or prevented. The word stabilized appeared once, in a subordinate clause, with no attribution. Patient's name did not appear anywhere in the document. She folded the papers back into the envelope and put them in the kitchen drawer, where she kept bills and other documents she needed not lose. Then she went for a run, which was the thing she did when she was working through, something that prose couldn't resolve. The bike path along the river was mostly empty at mid-morning on a Wednesday. A few dog walkers, a man in his 70s doing a slow and determined shuffle that Mara found, in an obscure way, comforting. Her knee complained through the first mile and then settled into something manageable. The river was gray-brown and running fast from the rain, carrying leaves and the occasional plastic bottle toward whatever came next. She ran 4 miles and came back and showered and made actual coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen counter, which was where she was when the second call came. Not Voss, not Tate, a different unknown number. Miss Doyle. The voice was male, older than Voss's contact from 2 days before, with the particular flatness of someone who made calls like this routinely. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Gerald Rusk. The director would like to meet with you, informally. Mara set her coffee down. About. The director feels the situation may have been handled in a way that didn't fully account for the circumstances. He'd like the opportunity to discuss. Tell me something, Mara said. Is this call being recorded on your end? A pause. I'm not in a position to. I'll take that as a yes. She picked up her coffee again. Tell the director that I've received the termination documentation, and I'm in the process of reviewing my options. If he'd like to communicate officially, he can do so through the proper channels. She paused. And tell him that anything informal tends to become formal fairly quickly when federal agencies are involved. She let that land. The voice said, after a beat, I'll pass that along. She ended the call. Then she immediately called Voss's contact number. She'd been given a direct line at the end of the federal building meeting and reported the substance of the conversation verbatim. Voss listened without interrupting and said she'd note it and that Mara had handled it correctly. Did Russick know about Ashworth's background before the intake? Mara asked. That's part of what we're building, Voss said. She paused, which for Voss was notable. She was not a person who paused without reason. Ashworth is going to be well enough for a longer conversation in about 72 hours. When that happens, we'd like you present. Mara hadn't expected that. Why? Because he asked, Voss said simply, and ended the call. The 72 hours were the worst of the waiting. Not because nothing happened. Things happened, just none of them to Mara directly, and most of them at a remove, she found maddening. Voss sent 2 text updates that were informative primarily in what they chose not to say. Brannigan from Harwick HR's sent a follow-up email about the timeline for returning Mara's personal items from her locker, which she found so surreally mundane that she read it twice to make sure it was real. Her neighbor Terry, who was 64 and retired from the postal service and had no knowledge of any of the current situation, knocked on the duplex door with a container of soup she'd made too much of, and Mara stood in the doorway talking to her for 20 minutes about Terry's grandson's soccer tournament, which was the most normal 20 minutes she'd had in 4 days, and which helped unexpectedly and considerably. On the second day, she drove past Harwick Military Medical Center without planning to. She'd been running an errand on the far side of town, and her route back took her along the service road that ran past the facility's east side, and she slowed without thinking when she saw 2 vehicles in the administrative parking lot that hadn't to be dark sedans, government plates, parked at angles that suggested they'd arrived in a hurry. She didn't stop. She kept driving and noted the plate sequences from memory and texted them to Voss when she got home. Voss responded, 11 minutes later, already aware. Thank you. Mara stared at that for a while. Already aware, which meant whatever was happening in that administrative parking lot was something Voss's people had put in motion or were actively monitoring. And the sedans were either investigators or they were the other thing, the response to investigators. Problem with situations like this one, she'd learned years ago, was that both categories looked identical from a service road. She ate dinner. She slept better than she had previous nights, which she attributed to exhaustion. rather than peace of mind. She woke at 5:15, lay in bed for a while, listening to the specific silence of a city before it started, which was different from actual quiet. It had texture, had depth, had the occasional distant sound of something moving that made the silence around it more present. 7:40 a.m. on the third morning, Voss called. "He's ready," she said. "Can you be at the Millhaven Secure Medical Facility by 10? Mara had not heard of Millhaven Secure Medical Facility. "Where is it?" "I'll send a driver." The drive was 50 minutes southeast, through a landscape that transitioned from Harwick's suburban sprawl into stretches of flat agricultural land broken by tree lines and the occasional water tower. The driver was a young man in civilian clothes, who gave his name as Torres and spoke exactly twice in the drive, once to offer water from a cooler in the back, and once, when they turned onto an unmarked road, to say they were 15 minutes out, accepted the water and looked out the window and let her mind work them through what she was going into, which was imprecise enough to require the kind of preparation that so it was more about state of mind than information. Millhaven turned out to be a low gray building set back from the road, behind a chain-link fence with no external signage of any kind. The security at the entrance was tighter than the federal building. 2 checks, both staffed by people in plainclothes, who nonetheless had the carriage of people who carried weapons as a professional habit. Mara's bag went through a scanner. She signed 2 documents, one of which she was allowed to keep a copy of, and one of which she wasn't. Voss met her in a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and climate-controlled recycled air, specific smell of a medical facility that wasn't quite a hospital, that occupied some operational space between clinical care and something else. "He's been briefed that you're coming," Voss said as they walked. "He's been cleared for 30 minutes of conversation. He may get tired before that. He lost a significant amount of blood, and his system is still processing. Fades, we stop." "Understood," Mara said. "One more thing." Voss stopped outside a door. "He knows you were fired." Mara looked at her. "We told him. We thought he should know the full situation." Voss said it without apology, which Mara respected. She nodded. Voss opened the door. The room was small and private, not an ICU bay, but a recovery room, which meant Ashworth had cleared one significant threshold already. He was sitting up at roughly 45 degrees, which by itself told her that his respiratory function had stabilized enough to tolerate the position. He was still connected to monitoring equipment and an IV line, and there was a pulse oximeter on his left index finger, and his color was significantly better than the gray-blue she'd last seen on the gurney, though he was pale in the manner of someone who'd lost blood recently and hadn't fully replaced it. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s. Strong jaw was there, more visible now, without the slack of unconsciousness. The old scar from his temple to his mouth was exactly where she'd noted it on the gurney. He watched her cross the room with dark eyes that were alert in the way of someone pushing through fatigue to maintain it, the kind of alertness that was effortful, not natural. "You're Doyle," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "Yes. They told me you spotted the pneumo when 3 attendings missed it." "2 residents and a traveling nurse," she said, pulling a chair to the bedside without being invited and sitting in it. Ostrauss was in the doorway. Something that might have been a very limited version of a smile crossed his face. He always was. Mara filed that. "You know Osterhaus." "I know of him." He shifted slightly, and she saw the brief compression of his jaw that meant the movement had cost something. "He's on a consult list for meridians." He stopped, looked at the door, looked back. "Voss said I could talk to you." She said 30 minutes. "Then I'll be fast." He settled back. "I've been running an investigation into Meridian Logistics Group's current contract portfolio for 7 months. Specifically their field medical supply chain for 2 active overseas operations. Same pattern you flagged 8 years ago. Compromised equipment, substituted components, failures at point of use." He paused to breathe, and the pause was longer than it should have been, which told her the left lung was still working at reduced capacity. It got worse. They're not just cutting corners on supply quality anymore. They've embedded a reporting manipulation system into the contract monitoring process. Results get falsified before they reach the oversight committee. People on the committee who might catch it, another pause, are on Meridian's payrolls in some form or another, including Rusk, Mara said. He looked at her. You got there fast. The sedans in the parking lot were a flag. She leaned forward slightly. You said you distributed documentation before transport. Where? Encrypted partitions on 3 separate servers. 2 of them are accessible to people I trust. One of them, he stopped again, and this time it wasn't the lung. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone deciding something in real time. One of them requires a 2-person authentication. The second person is someone I haven't been able to reach. Who? He held her gaze for a moment. A source inside Meridian's logistics management division. Someone who's been pulling internal records for 4 months and transmitting them through a cutout. I haven't had direct communication with them since 2 days before the explosion. He said explosion with a particular inflection that conveyed what he thought about the word explosion. They've been identified. You think someone in the transport chain leaked your source's identity. I think the sedative they put in my system 3 days before the incident wasn't random timing. I think someone moved the schedule up. He looked at his hands, the IV line, the pulse ox, the particular helplessness of lying in a recovery bed when things were still in motion outside of it. I've been running through the sequence. The only person outside my chain who knew I was going to be transported through Harwick that night was someone in the facility's administrative intake process. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the monitor's soft rhythm. Osterhaus didn't walk into that bay by accident, Mara said. No. He was supposed to manage the outcome. Ashworth didn't answer that directly. He said, how thorough were your notes from the intake? 3 pages. Time-stamped, sequential. She paused. Including the second medic's radio and the Shell Company vehicle registration that Voss confirmed afterward. He nodded slowly, something releasing in his face. Voss said, you were thorough. I wanted to. He stopped, and the fatigue pressed through for a moment, visibly, the way it did when someone had been holding it back, and briefly let it slip. I wanted to hear it from you. What you saw. Why? Because I've been trying to figure out whether anyone on the inside of that facility was acting in good faith, or whether the whole chain was compromised. He looked at her steadily. You weren't supposed to be in that bay. No. You went in anyway. Yes. Why? Mara thought about it, actually thought, rather than producing the clean answer. Because his lips were the wrong color, she said finally, and nobody was moving. Ashworth was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, okay. Like that settled something. Like that was the thing he'd actually needed to know, underneath all the operational questions. Voss came in at the 28-minute mark and made eye contact with Mara, not quite a signal to stop, but a flag that they were getting close. Mara stood. The source inside Meridian, she said. The one you haven't been able to reach. Do you have any way of knowing whether they're still active or whether they've been burned? Ashworth looked at the ceiling for a moment. There's a dead drop protocol. If they're active and the drop is clean, there'll be a marker on a specific public record. They update it periodically. I haven't been able to check it from in here. What record? He told her. It was a specific public business registration in a specific county database, the kind of thing that was genuinely public, accessible to anyone, and that would look completely unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking for the particular update that meant something. She committed it to memory rather than writing it down, because she'd been in rooms with secure medical facilities and government investigators, and she understood what got written down and what didn't. I'll check it, she said. He looked at her. You're not part of this investigation. I'm a private citizen who's been asked to be reachable, she said, and I have internet access. She walked out into the corridor where Voss was waiting with her arms folded and an expression that was carefully neutral. You heard that, Mara said. The room is monitored, Voss confirmed. The dead drop. We're aware of the protocol. We haven't been able to access the relevant record from inside official channels without triggering a flag in Meridian's monitoring network. Their financial arm has a passive surveillance layer on certain government access points. Voss paused. A private citizen accessing a public county database wouldn't trigger the same flag. Mara looked at her. You were going to ask me. I was working up to it, Voss said, which was the closest thing to dry humor Mara had heard from her. Send me the exact search parameters. They walked back down the antiseptic corridor and through the checkpoints and out into the flat gray daylight of the parking lot, where Torres was waiting with the same car and the same economy of expression. The drive back was the same 50 minutes in reverse, the agricultural flatness giving way to Harwick's edges, the occasional water tower appearing and receding. Mara sat in the back with Voss's text on her phone, the specific county, the specific registration, the specific field to look for, and thought about a source inside Meridian Logistics who had been transmitting internal records through a cutout for 4 months, and who had gone silent 2 days before someone put a sedative compound into a Navy commander's system. She thought about that person, whoever they were, wherever they were, and the decision they'd made to start pulling records, which was never a small decision. Nobody made that decision lightly. There was always something that pushed it over the edge. She checked the county database from her phone in the car because there was no reason to wait. The record loaded. It was a standard business registration for a logistics consulting firm. 3 paragraphs, filing dates, registered agent information. The specific field Ashworth had told her to check was the secondary contact listing, updated quarterly. The update was timestamped. Mara read the timestamp and then read it again. It had been updated 41 minutes ago. The source was active. And in the additional notes field, a section that the registration form allowed for optional text, the kind of field that most businesses left blank there, was a single line that had not been there in any previous filing period. It read, Doyle knows. Mara stared at her phone screen as the car moved through Harwick's outer streets. Her thumb hovered over the screen. The afternoon light was flat and pale and fell through the car window across her hands. The source inside Meridian Logistics. Someone she had never met, whose name she didn't know, who had been systematically dismantling a corrupt contractor operation from the inside for 4 months, knew her name. And that meant someone inside Meridian knew she had been in that trauma bay, which meant the people who had arranged for Darian Ashworth to be transported to Harwick Military Medical Center on a rainy Tuesday night, sedated and dying, already knew that the one person who shouldn't have been in the room had seen everything. She forwarded the screenshot to Voss without a message. Voss called back in 4 minutes. Stay in the car, she said. Don't go home yet. Why, Mara said, though something in her stomach already knew. Because there's a vehicle parked outside your duplex. That wasn't there this morning, Voss said. And the plates don't come back to anyone we recognize. Torres heard the call. He didn't react to it, didn't turn, didn't ask. But Mara saw his right hand move to the console and tap something, and the car's speed increased by about 8 miles per hour in a way that felt practiced rather than panicked. He already knew, which meant Voss had communicated with him on a separate channel before calling Mara, which meant the 41-minute-old database update and the unregistered vehicle outside her duplex were things that had triggered a response in the time between Mara forwarding the screenshot and Voss calling back. 4 minutes was enough time to move assets if you already had them positioned. Where are we going? Mara said. Somewhere that isn't your address, Torres said, and that was the second time he'd spoken during either drive, and the most words he'd used at once. Voss was still on the line. We're putting you in a secure location for the next few hours while we assessed the vehicle situation. It may be nothing surveillance only. We want to know before you walk into it. And if it's not surveillance only, then we're glad you're not walking into it, Voss said, which was not the reassurance it was technically shaped like. They drove for another 20 minutes, eastward and then south, into a part of Harwick that was neither commercial nor residential in any obvious way, a transitional zone of light industrial buildings and storage facilities, and the kind of small professional offices that housed accountants and insurance, adjusters, and people whose work required no signage. Torres pulled into the lot of a building that looked like a regional logistics company from the outside, which Mara thought was either ironic or deliberate, and settled on deliberate. He used a key card at the gate and again at the door, and the interior was nothing like a logistics company. It was a functional operations space with workstations and wall-mounted monitors and the specific organized density of a team that lived in a location for extended periods. There were 4 other people inside. None of them introduced themselves. One of them handed Mara a bottle of water without being asked, which she appreciated in an uncomplicated way. Voss arrived 22 minutes later, in person, which told Mara the situation had escalated past the level where phone management was sufficient. She came in fast and went directly to one of the wall monitors and pulled up a street-level camera feed that resolved into the block where Mara's duplex sat. The unregistered vehicle was visible, a dark blue panel van parked 40 feet past the duplex entrance, facing the building. Commercial markings. Windows tinted to the legal limit, which meant the tint was probably not what was actually installed. "We ran the VIN," Voss said. "Registered to an equipment rental company in Roanoke that dissolved 8 months ago. The same company name appears in Meridian's secondary vendor list for regional operations support." Mara looked at the van on the screen. It hadn't moved. "They're not there to hurt me," she said. "Not yet. They wanted to do that. They wouldn't park 40 feet out in daylight." "Agreed. They're documenting whether you've been contacted, who comes and goes, whether investigators are visible. They want to know how much you've communicated and to whom." Voss turned from the monitor. "The dead drop update changes the kin. It's the calculation. If the source tagged you by name, they've been watching the Harwick situation closely enough to know your role in it. That means Meridian's internal security apparatus knows the same thing. And someone's inside Meridian's apparatus made the update," Mara said, "or the source made it as a warning. Both readings of Doyle knows are possible." Voss sat down at one of the workstations. "Tell me exactly what Ashworth said about the source. Word for word if you can." Mara went through it. Voss typed. The room's ambient noise was the sound of 3 other people working on adjacent problems. The particular focused quiet of people doing things that required attention. When Mara finished, Voss read back through her notes and then said, 4 months of internal records transmitted through a cutout. That's a substantial volume of material. If Ashworth's encryption partition is intact, it is, said one of the other people in the room, a woman at a workstation near the far wall, who hadn't looked up from her screen until now. She had the specific pallor of someone who spent most of her working hours in this kind of environment, and she spoke with the brevity of someone accustomed to being understood quickly. Partition 2 is confirmed intact. Partition 3 is the 2-person authentication. Ashworth told me what the second person has, Mara said. He didn't tell me what he has. Which half is he holding? He holds the second key, the woman said. The source holds the first. Ashworth can't open the partition alone, even if we get him full system access. The room was quiet for a moment. So the partition opens if the source authenticates, Morris said. And the source has gone partially dark, Voss said. Active enough to update the dead drop. Not active enough to initiate direct contact. Mara thought about the timestamp. 41 minutes after she'd left Millhaven. They updated the drop after I visited Ashworth. Voss looked at her. The timing. It's not a coincidence. Someone knew I visited him, and the source updated the drop in response. She paused, which means either Millhaven has a monitoring breach, or the source is closer to this situation than Ashworth realized, Voss said. She said it carefully, which meant she'd already considered. Mara looked at the van on the monitor feed. Still not moving. I want to access the dead drop again, she said. Right now, from this location. See if the note field has changed since the first update. Voss nodded to the woman at the far workstation. The woman pulled up a browser and navigated and turned her screen toward Mara. County database record loaded. The secondary contact listing. The timestamp still 41 minutes ago, unchanged. The note field, except it wasn't the same. The line Doyle knows was gone. In its place was a different line, 4 words, added within the last 20 minutes. She needs to look. Mara read it twice. Then she looked at Voss. Look at what? Nobody in the room answered, because nobody knew. They kept her in the operations space for 6 hours. Not in prison she could have left, and she knew it, and Voss knew she knew it. But the van outside her duplex hadn't moved, and the evening had come down, and the practical calculus of leaving was not in her favor. She used the time. One of the other operatives, a quiet, heavy-set man named Garrett, who turned out to have a medical background of his own, former Purisescu, brought food from somewhere that wasn't a vending machine, and she ate it at a workstation while she went through everything she'd written on her legal pad from the beginning. She was looking for what she'd shift, not what she'd toed, not what she'd failed to observe. She trusted her observations, but what she'd seen without understanding. There was always something like that, always a detail that registered correctly but resolved incorrectly because the frame around it was wrong. The lateral scar, pre-existing pleural compromise, 2 weeks old minimum. She'd read it as evidence of a prior injury, evidence that the explosion narrative was false, that Ashworth had been compromised before the incident. Reading was correct, but she'd been thinking of the scar as a product of the prior injury. What if it wasn't? What if the scar was from a procedure, a therapeutic procedure, or she stopped, or a deliberate one? She pulled up the anatomical reference on the workstation with Fort Garrison authorization and looked at what was consistent with a healed lateral thoracic incision of the length and angle she'd observed. Placement was wrong for a standard thoracentesis. It was wrong for a biopsy. It was consistent with something that required access to the pleural space itself, the interior, not just the wall. She sat back. Garrett, she said. He looked up from across the room. If you needed to ensure a specific patient developed respiratory complications under predictable conditions that could be timed, what would you use? He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't understand the question, but because he was taking it seriously. Depends on how sophisticated you wanted to be. Crude version is external compression, but that leaves evidence. More sophisticated, he paused. You'd want something internal. A small controlled compromise of the pleural membrane that could be triggered or accelerated by accelerated physiological stress. Could you implant something? Another pause. Longer. Theoretically. A degradable structure, something that would breach under specific pressure conditions, like extreme exertion, or the pressure differential from an explosion, Mara said. Garrett put down what he was holding. That scar isn't from an injury, Mara said. It's from an implantation. Someone put something inside his pleural space that was designed to rupture when he was exposed to a blast event. She looked at Voss, who had come to stand at the edge of the workstation area without Mara noticing. The explosion wasn't meant to kill him directly. It was meant to activate something that was already inside him. Something put there while he was, she thought through the timeline, while he was somewhere he trusted. A medical facility. A routine procedure. Voss's face had gone very still. What the source has been transmitting, Mara said. Not just supply chain records. Medical procedure records. Someone with access to Meridian's logistics management also had access to, or knowledge of a medical protocol that was being used operationally. She looked at Garrett. That's what the partition contains. That's what requires two-person authentication, because one person knowing this isn't enough. It requires corroboration. The room had that quality of silence that happened when several people were recalibrating simultaneously. Voss said quietly and with precision, "We need the source to authenticate." "I know," Mara said, and they put my name in the dead drop. It took Voss 40 minutes to construct the argument to her superior. The call happened in a separate room with the door closed and another 30 minutes for the authorization to come back. Mara spent that time outside, in the lot, which was enclosed by a fence and counted as controlled space, where the temperature had dropped to the upper 30s, and her breath made small, visible clouds. She wasn't cold exactly, she'd been colder, in places that made a Virginia November feel administrative, but the air was useful for thinking. She thought about the source. 4 months of internal records. Cutout. Careful. Patient. The decision to start pulling files was not a small one, and she'd already thought about that. But now she thought about the specific moment, the thing that had pushed it from consideration to action. In her experience, people who made that decision had usually seen something that made continued inaction feel like complicity, a line crossed, a specific harm, something concrete rather than systemic. Whatever the source had seen, it had been enough, and now they'd put her name in a public record, which was either the most careful signal possible or the most desperate one. Voss came out at 9:15 p.m. You're authorized to make contact through the dead drop. We'll give you a response protocol, a specific update to make to the record that the source will recognize as secure. They're monitoring and they're still active, so they should respond within. She paused. We don't know how quickly they can respond. It depends on their situation. And if Meridian is monitoring the drop, they're monitoring it. Assume that. So whatever I put in that field, they see. Yes. So we're giving you language that reads as innocuous to anyone who doesn't know what to look for. Voss held out a folded piece of paper. This is what you write. Mara read it. It was 4 words, a business registration update, the kind of minor administrative language that appeared in those records routinely. To someone scanning for operational signals, it meant nothing.
Yeah.
To someone who knew what channel they were in and what sequence had been established, it was a specific message. It said, I'm ready. Contact me. She updated the record from her phone, sitting on the steps of the operations building, at 9:23 p.m. Then they waited. The source responded at 11:47 p.m., not through the dead drop. Through a different channel, entirely a direct message to an email address that Mara had listed as her professional contact on a public nursing registry profile, an address she hadn't checked in 8 months. The message was 8 words. The second set of records is in the hospital. Mara read it 3 times. Then she showed Voss. Voss read it and said nothing for a moment. Then, which hospital? There was only one hospital in this chain that connected everything. There was only one facility where a medical procedure could have been performed on Ashworth under controlled conditions, where Meridian had access and influence, where a second set of records corroborating medical records, procedure records could have been placed or hidden a system that Meridian's financial surveillance layer didn't cover. Harwick Military Medical Center, Mara said. In the records system. Somewhere in the restricted intake documentation from the night he was brought in. She thought through it. They had access to the intake process. They controlled what went into his file. But whoever the source is, they also had access to what went in. And they added something. Without Meridian knowing, Voss said. Without Meridian knowing. Because it would look like standard intake documentation, unless you knew what you were looking for. Voss looked at her. We can't access Harwick's restricted intake records through official channels without triggering. The same surveillance layer, Mara said. I know. There was a moment. I still have my hospital badge, Mara said. They asked me to surrender it. I left it on the conference table. She paused. I didn't specifically watch them pick it up. Voss's expression shifted by a few degrees. That badge was deactivated when your termination processed. I know. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Mara said. I'm noting that I know the physical layout of Harwick's records annex. I know which terminals access the restricted intake archive. I know which route through the facility covers the most ground with the least surveillance overlap. And I know the night shift rotation schedule from 2 years of working it. She paused. I'm also noting that a private citizen accessing a public county database doesn't trigger Meridian's flag. A deactivated badge does, Voss said. The moment you try to use it, I don't need the badge to get in the building. I need it to look like I belong there. She looked at Voss steadily. I was on staff at Harwick for 2 years. I know every non-badged entry point that exists because the badge readers fail in cold weather, and staff find workarounds. I know which loading dock has a reader that hasn't worked since February. I know that the night records technician takes a 15-minute break at 1:30 a.m. that she logs as a bathroom break, but is actually a smoke break in the stairwell at the east end. She stopped. And I know that whatever is in that intake file is going to disappear if we wait for official authorization to access it. Because Meridian's people are sitting in a van outside my house, and they know the dead drop was accessed. Voss looked at her for a long moment. The operations room was visible through the behind her at Garrett and the woman and the others. Still working, the screen's still lit. Can't authorize this, Voss said. I know, Mara said. If you're caught inside a facility from which you've been formally terminated. I know. The legal exposure would Voss. Mara said it the way you said someone's name when you needed them to stop performing the caveat and get to the actual question. Do you want what's in that file or not? A long silence. Outside the fence, the street was empty and dark. I need a 2-hour window, Voss said finally. I'll pull the surveillance camera maintenance schedule for Harwick's exterior system. There's a quarterly firmware update that runs between 130 and 145 exterior cameras on the north and east wings drop offline during the cycle. She said it with the flatness of someone reading a document. That's public information. Maintenance schedule is filed with the city contractor office. Right, Mara said. Torres will drive you to within 3 blocks and wait. Voss looked away, not at anything specific, just away. Whatever you find, photograph it with your phone. Don't remove anything. Don't interact with any personnel. And Doyle, she looked back. If anything looks wrong the moment you're inside, you leave. You don't problem solve, you don't push through, you leave, and we find another way. Understood? Understood, Mara said. She didn't ask what another way might be, because she was fairly certain there wasn't one, and they both knew it. Torres dropped her 3 blocks north of Harwick Military Medical Center at 1:12 a.m. The street was the kind of empty that cities reached after midnight on weekdays, not abandoned, but drained. The ambient activity reduced to the distant sound of a vehicle somewheres, and the persistent orange glow of streetlights on wet pavement. Mara walked south in her civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark pants, the kind of outfit that was unremarkable without being conspicuous. She was carrying her work bag, which she'd had in the car since the first morning of all this, and which still held a stethoscope and her legal pad and the things that accumulated in a nurse's bag over 2 years of regular use. She pulled the hospital ID lanyard out of the side pocket the badge Rusk's conference table had apparently not fully claimed and put it around her neck. A deactivated badge looked exactly like an active one. The loading dock on the building's northwest corner had a badge reader mounted at 45 degrees to the doorframe, the angle, the result of a bracket repair done wrong in February that maintenance had never corrected. In cold weather below 40 degrees, which tonight was the reader's contact plate, contracted enough that it lost about 30% of its scanning reliability. Mara had used this specific workaround 4 times during the previous winter, when the night shift staffing had run short and she'd needed to move between wings fast. You held the badge close to the upper edge of the reader, not the center, and you pushed the door handle simultaneously, and the door opened. It opened on the second try. The loading dock corridor was lit by emergency overheads, the dimmer, greenish lighting that ran at night when the main systems were on reduced power. It smelled like cleaning solution and the particular staleness of a building that had been processing the same air through the same systems for decades. Mara moved down the corridor with the pace of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be, not hurrying, not hesitating. Corridor speed was everything. A person moving with deliberate, moderate pace in a hospital at 1:20 a.m. read as shift change or late patient care. Anyone moving faster read as emergency. Anyone slower read as lost. She went through 2 internal doors, both on mechanical release, no badge required, and up a stairwell to the second floor, where the records annex was located in a space that the facility had repurposed from what had originally been a supply overflow room. The records annex had 4 terminals and a physical filing system, and one night technician, whose name was Bonnie and who had, on 3 separate occasions in the past 2 years, shared her vending machine coffee with Mara during overlap periods between their respective shifts. At 1:29 a.m., Mara stood outside the annex door and listened. She heard the specific sound of a chair moving, then footsteps. Then the stairwell door at the east end of the corridor opened and clicked shut, which was the sound of Bonnie's 1:30 break, running 1 minute ahead of schedule. 15 minutes. The annex door required a badge. This one she couldn't work around with cold weather and a broken bracket. She held her badge to the reader and waited for the denial tone, and instead heard nothing. No tone, no green light. The door didn't open. She tried again. Same result, not a denial, not an acceptance, just electronic silence. The reader was offline. She pushed the door. It swung open. The reader had dropped with the camera's part of the same firmware cycle, something she hadn't known, and Voss apparently hadn't either. She filed that and moved. The restricted intake archive terminal was the second one from the left. She had to navigate through 2 menu levels to reach the intake records. She knew the system, because she'd filed in it for 2 years, and she typed Ashworth's intake date and the Trauma Bay 2 designation, and waited for the record to pull. Came up in 12 seconds. The file was flagged restricted in 3 places with military classification markers. Standard intake notes were there. Osterhaus's entries, 2 resident signatures, the transport documentation. All of it consistent with what she expected. And then, at the bottom of the file, in the section reserved for secondary clinical observations, a section that was technically part of the record, but rarely accessed, rarely audited, there was a note. Entered at 2:41 a.m. on the morning after Ashworth's intake, time-stamped under a user access code she didn't recognize. She photographed the note with her phone. Then she read it again because she needed to read it with her own eyes, not just through the camera. It was clinical language, precise, structured, the kind of notation that would pass a cursory review as standard medical documentation. But it wasn't standard. It was a procedure's description. 37 lines. A left lateral thoracic implant procedure performed under general anesthesia at a facility she didn't recognize Braemar Clinical Associates, which she had never heard of, and which did not appear in any Harwick documentation. Performed 11 days before Ashworth's transport, including the device specification, including the activation parameters, including the name of the authorizing physician, Dr. Philip Osterhaus. Mara photographed all 37 lines. She checked the time, 1:38 a.m. 7 minutes before Bonnie's return. Closed the terminal, backed to move to the door. She was 3 steps into the corridor when the lights changed. Not the camera firmware cycle, those lights had gone green again at 1:45, which was still 7 minutes away. These were the main corridor overheads, switching from night mode to full operational, which happened at 2 different times, 6 a.m. for the day shift, and she knew this in response to a security level activation anywhere in the facility, which meant an alarm had been triggered somewhere in the building. She went still. Not frozen, calculated stillness, the kind that let her listen without the interference of her own movement. Corridor was empty. No footsteps yet. The alarm, if it was local, would bring security staff from the ground floor first, then the administrative floors. She had approximately 90 seconds before someone was in this corridor. She moved to the stairwell, not the east end, where Bonnie would be returning, but the west end, the one that exited 2 floors down into the physical therapy wing, which connected to a corridor that ran behind the main ER and eventually reached a staff bathroom with a window that led out into a narrow service passage she'd used exactly once before, 3 winters ago, psychologically, professionally, when she'd locked herself out of her car and needed to reach her spare key in the parking lot without going through the main lobby. She went down the stairs at controlled speed, fast enough to clear the floors, slow enough to not lose her footing, and through the PT wing and the connecting corridor and into the staff bathroom. She locked the door behind her. Through the window, she could hear something she hadn't heard from inside voices exterior, the specific crackling of radio communication outside the building. Not just one voice, multiple. She climbed onto the counter, unlatched the window, looked out. The service passage was empty, but at the far end, visible at the corner where the passage met the facility's south lot, there were two figures in dark clothing who were not hospital security and who were moving toward the building with the specific purposeful economy of people who knew exactly where they were going. Not security responding to her. Something else. Something arriving. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Voss. She answered without speaking, which was the signal they'd established for can't talk. Voss said, "Get out of the building right now. Don't use the loading dock. Torres is repositioning. He'll be on Meridian Street in 4 minutes. The alley entrance behind the parking structure. Go there." A pause, and Mara could hear something in the background on Voss's end voices. Movement, the ambient sound of the operations room in high gear. Ashworth's secure location has been compromised. We're moving him. Someone accessed Millhaven's external communication log and traced the visitor record. Mara was already through the window and into the service passage. "How?" she said, barely audible. "We don't know yet. But Doyle," Voss's voice shifted by a register, something that in another person might have been the edge of alarm. The authorization for the Millhaven visit came from inside Harwick's administrative office. Someone in facility's administrative chain was copied on the clearance request. We didn't catch it until 20 minutes ago. Mara moved through the service passage toward the parking structure. Two figures at the south corner were no longer visible, which meant they'd entered the building. Cold air was sharp and very clear, and her breath made visible clouds that she was aware of in the way you became aware of things that could be seen. "Who was copied?" she said. "Rusk," Voss said. "Rusk's office was copied on your visitor authorization." She reached the end of the service passage. The parking structure was ahead, the alley entrance dark, pressed flat against the exterior wall and looked both ways. Empty. She moved. "Voss," she said quietly, "the second set of records. I have them. Photographed." Ostrauss authorized the procedure. Braemar Clinical Associates, 11 days prior. She kept moving. 37 lines of implant procedure documentation in Ashworth's intake file entered at 2:41 a.m. by an unidentified access code. Someone put it there to be found. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Doyle. Voss's voice had changed completely. "The access code on that entry, did you catch the format?" 6 characters. Alphanumeric. "I photographed the full screen. Send me the photographs right now." Mara sent them while moving through the alley. She heard the photos deliver. She heard Voss make a sound not quite sharp enough to be a gasp, but in that direction. "What?" Mara said. "That access code," Voss said. "It belongs to a staff member who was terminated from Harwick 2 months ago." A pause. "A records technician. Left under the official reason is administrative restructuring. But there's a grievance on file." Mara saw the parking structure entrance. She saw Torres's car, headlights off, at the alley mouth. Started moving faster. "What's the technician's name?" she said. "Doyle." Voss said her name with the particular weight of someone who had just understood something that changed the shape of everything. "The technician's name is Bonnie Skaggs." Mara stopped moving. Behind her, from the direction of the building she'd just exited, she heard a door open, then footsteps. Then, very clearly, she heard a voice. She recognized not one of the dark-clothed figures from the south corner, not hospital security, but a voice she had placed, before she consciously identified it, the particular measured cadence she'd heard in a conference room while she'd been fired. Gerald Rusk, outside the building, at 1:43 a.m., moving toward the service passage, and from inside her phone. Before she could speak, she heard Voss say, "The van left your duplex 11 minutes ago. We don't know where it went." Mara moved before the decision fully formed. That was the thing about training that nobody explained. Well, it didn't make you fearless. It just collapsed the gap between perception and action until the body was already doing the right thing while the mind was still catching up. She was against the far wall of the alley, in the shadow gap between utility cabinet and the parking structure's concrete support column, before Rusk's footsteps had cleared the service passage entrance. She killed her phone screen with her thumb and stood absolutely still and breathed through her nose in the slow, controlled rhythm that kept the chest quiet. Rusk came out of the passage with another person behind him. Male, heavier build, moving with the particular blunt efficiency of someone whose job was not to think, but to locate. He had a flashlight, the beam sweeping the alley in the wide pattern of someone who knew they were looking for something, but wasn't certain where. The beam passed 6 inches from Mara's left shoulder. He did not move. Rusk said something to the other man in a voice low enough that she caught the tone, clipped, impatient, but not the words. The other man moved the beam again toward the parking structure entrance, and they stood there for a moment in a way that felt like a decision point. Then Rusk's phone rang. He answered it, listened for approximately 8 seconds, and said, "When?" Followed by a silence, and then all of it in a voice that had changed register entirely, the controlled impatience gone, replaced by something that Mara read as the specific anxiety of a man receiving news he'd been dreading. He turned back toward the service passage, without another sweep of the alley. The heavy-built man followed. The door closed. Mara waited 12 seconds, counted them, and then moved fast along the alley wall to Torres's car, opened the back door, and got in. Torres pulled out before she'd fully closed the door, headlights still off, until they reached the parking structure, exit, then into Meridian Street traffic at a speed and manner that was completely unremarkable from outside the vehicle. Mara had the phone to her ear. "Voss, I see your mobile," Voss said. She'd been tracking Torres. "What happened in the alley?" Rusk came out through the service passage. He got a call, went back in. Whatever the call said, he was shaken. She pulled the seatbelt across and clicked it into place. Coincides with something. "What happened on your end in the last 4 minutes?" A pause. "We found the van. Where? 2 blocks from Millhaven. It was abandoned. Driver's door open. The 2 occupants we don't have them yet. But we found a Meridian-linked cell phone inside the van, unlocked, with an active conversation in progress. We intercepted it." Another pause. "Doyle, someone called the van from inside Harwick's administrative office 17 minutes ago. Whoever made that call told the van team to abort. Used language that made clear the operation was their word was unwound." Mara sat with that. Someone inside Harwick pulled them back. Someone who decided at 1:30 in the morning that the risk profile had changed enough to call off an active surveillance team. Voss's voice had the quality of someone assembling pieces in real time, which tracks with Rusk's call in the alley. "I think someone above Rusk in this chain made a decision. Meridian's executive layer, possibly, or their legal counsel. The moment the dead drop activated, the moment Ashworth's documentation was confirmed intact, someone, at the top of this, decided that aggressive action against a former hospital nurse, who's now clearly cooperating with a federal investigation, was not a survivable PR position." A pause. "They're not retreating because they're scared of you. They're retreating because they're scared of the evidentiary chain you're part of." Mara looked out the car window at Harwick, moving past in the dark. A gas station. A 24-hour pharmacy with half its sign letters burned out. A particular nighttime plainness of a city that existed for functional reasons. "What about Bonnie?" she said. The silence this time was a different kind. "We made contact," Voss said, 20 minutes ago. "She's safe. She's been out of the building since 1:35 earlier than her usual break. She knew we'd access the record because she'd set a notification flag on the file. When it triggered, she left." Voss paused. "She wants to talk to you, specifically. She was very specific about that. They brought Bonnie Skaggs to the operations building at 3:15 a.m. She arrived looking exactly like someone who had been sitting in a car for 90 minutes after the most consequential night of her professional life, coat still on, hair Still in the bun she'd put it in for her shift, a paper coffee cup from somewhere that she was holding with both hands. She was 52, short, with the kind of face that showed everything it was feeling, because she'd never found adequate reason to learn otherwise. When she saw Mara, she stopped in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in and sat down at the table where Mara was waiting and put her coffee down and folded her hands on top of each other. "I didn't know your name when I put it in the drop," she said. "I mean, I knew your name. You worked nights for 2 years, and we had coffee at least 30 times. I knew your name, but I didn't know you were—" She stopped. "I didn't know you were the one who'd been with him in the bay. I found that out afterward from the incident report, and I thought—" She looked at her hands. "I thought that if they fired you for what you did in there, and if I'd already put what I put in his file, and if you'd been a medic before—" She stopped again. Felt like the right signal. "Walk me through it," Mara said. From the beginning. Bonnie's beginning was 8 months ago, 2 months, before she'd been terminated from Harwick, which she now described with the flat affect of someone who'd had time to process the anger down to something more compact. She'd been working late on a quarterly audit of the restricted intake archives when she'd noticed a discrepancy in the access logs, a record entry made under a user code that belonged to a physician who, according to Harwick's own HR system, had been on medical leave that week. The entry was in the intake file of a different patient, not Ashworth, who hadn't come through yet, and it was a procedure notation that made no clinical sense in the context of that patient's documented condition. She'd flagged it internally. The flag had gone nowhere, she'd asked Osterhaus directly, because the file was in his patient list. He'd told her it was a documentation error and would be corrected, and it never was. And 3 weeks later, she was called into a meeting with HR and told that her position was being eliminated in a restructuring and that today was her last day. "That's when I knew it wasn't a documentation error," she said. She'd kept a copy of the original access log anomaly, not on hospital systems, on her personal drive, which she'd had the presence of mind to pull before surrendering her workstation. Spent the next month trying to figure out what she was looking at and whether anyone with actual authority would care. "I found Ashworth's name in a public Naval Gazette notice," she said, commendation listing. "And I found Meridian's name in a federal procurement database, cross-referenced against the medical facility where Osterhaus had previously had staff privileges before Harwick. It took a long time." She said it without drama. "I was a records technician for 19 years. I know how to find things in databases. It's not exciting, but it's—" She paused. "It's what I knew how to do." And she'd established the dead drop protocol by doing research into how investigative cutouts worked. She said this with a brief, self-deprecating look, as though acknowledging the absurdity of a records technician teaching herself operational security from open-source material. The 4 months of transmission to Ashworth's cutout had been careful, incremental, and had cost her more sleep than she could calculate. When he came through Harwick's Bay, she said, "I was on shift. I saw his name on the intake flag before the restricted designation locked it down. And I knew I already had enough to know what his injuries actually meant. What had been done." She looked at Mara. "I was the one who entered the procedure record into his file, under my old access code, which shouldn't have still been active. They deactivated my badge access, but they didn't purge the archive code from the record system. Think they just forgot." Mara thought about administrative failures and how often the small ones were what held everything together. "You put the documentation in his file knowing someone might find it," Mara said. "Put it there knowing someone had to find it," Bonnie said. "Because I couldn't go to the investigators directly. I didn't have anyone I could trust to bring it to who wasn't already connected to Harwick's administrative chain. And I couldn't leave it on my own drive because if something happened to me," she stopped. "I needed it somewhere official. Somewhere that had a chain of custody." Mara sat back. The woman in front of her had spent 8 months doing the thing that Mara spent 8 months doing the thing that Mara had done 8 years ago, and had done it quietly and without any of the infrastructure that Mara had, at least theoretically, had access to as an active service member and had done it from the position of a fired records technician with no institutional backing whatsoever. The convergence of that two people, 8 years apart, working from different angles toward the same corrupted center, had the specific texture of coincidence that was actually pattern. Meridian had been doing this long enough that they'd created multiple people with reasons. "You did good work," Mara said. Bonnie looked at her and then looked at her hands. "I almost quit 4 times, she said. "The third time I almost quit, I actually wrote a letter saying I was done, and then I went to sleep, and in the morning I shredded it." She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because it's true," Mara said. Voss spent the next 3 hours on the phone. Mara heard the cadence of it from across the operations room, Vossi moving between calls with the focused velocity of someone who had a window and knew how long it would stay open. The photographs from the records terminal. Bonnie's personal archive. The intercepted van communication. Worth's encrypted partition, which Bonnie authenticated from the operations building, get 4:20 a.m., using the first key she'd been holding for 4 months, and which Ashworth authenticated remotely from his new secure location, using the second key, and which opened to reveal not one document, but a structured archive of 417 files. Garrett pulled the files onto a hardened system and started cataloging. He worked without commentary, which Mara was beginning to understand was his baseline, and every 20 minutes or so, he'd say a number, not a page count or a file count, but a specific figure, a dollar amount, or a date or an identifier, and Voss would stop whichever call she was on and write it down. At 5:47 a.m., Garrett said, "Osterhaus has a consulting contract." He said it the way you'd report a blood pressure, reading flat, precise. Braemar Clinical Associates. Monthly retainer for the last 3 years. Payment structure runs through a Meridian subsidiary. Mara had known it since she'd read the 37 lines. Seeing it confirmed still landed with a particular weight. "How many patients?" she said. Garrett looked at his screen. "The procedure protocol document lists 8 case identifiers. We have full records for 3. The others," he paused, "will need additional access." 8. Mara sat with that number. 8 people who'd had a device implanted in their pleural cavity under the care of a physician they'd trusted, activated by a blast event that someone had arranged, designed to look like combat injury. 8 people whose deaths or near deaths had been built into a contractor's operational logistics, the way you'd build a contingency into a supply chain. She stood up and walked to the far side of the room, where a window looked out onto the enclosed lot, now pale with the beginning of dawn. She stood there for a while. Not falling apart, she wasn't built for that, or had built herself away from it over years, but taking the 60 seconds it required to hold the full shape of what she was looking at before moving again. Then she moved again. "What do we need to formally trigger the Oversight Committee review?" she said. Voss looked up from her notes. Ashworth's testimony, plus corroborating documentation in the hands of the committee's independent counsel. The documentation is now authenticated. Ashworth is medically stable enough to provide a formal statement in approximately 12 hours. Rusk, Federal Building, 9 a.m. He doesn't know that yet. Osterhaus. Voss's expression did the thing it did when something was decided but not fully landed. Osterhaus presented himself at the facility at 6 a.m. for his regular shift. He's been asked to remain in a conference room pending a meeting with hospital administration. He believes the meeting is about the intake incident documentation. She paused. Going to find out it's something significantly broader. He'll lawyer up the moment someone uses the word federal. He already has a lawyer, Voss said. The lawyer is a partner at a firm that has Meridian as a client, which is going to create an interesting conflict of interest problem for the lawyer approximately 40 minutes into the morning. Mara almost said something about the specific satisfaction of watching a prepared position collapse under its own architecture, but didn't, because there was still too much in motion, and satisfaction had a way of softening attention. "What about the committee members on Meridian's payroll?" she said. "That's a longer process." The documentation gives us names and payment structures. Removing them from the committee, prosecuting them, months minimum. Years, probably. Voss said it without apology. That's how it works. I know, Mara said. She did know. She'd watched it work that way 8 years ago, and she'd found it intolerable, and she'd eventually learned the difference between intolerable and unchangeable, which was not a lesson she'd enjoyed. What we can do immediately, Voss said, is remove the contract. Meridian's current operational contracts go into suspension pending review once the Oversight Committee is notified. That happens today. Their field operations stop. She looked at Mara. Equipment they've been supplying the compromised supply chain that stops today. That was the thing underneath all of it. The thing Bonnie had spent 8 months working toward, without ever having met Ashworth. The thing Mara had filed a complaint about 8 years ago in a different office about a different set of forward units and had watched get classified and shelved. Equipment that failed in the field. People who died because something that was supposed to help them didn't work, and the company responsible collected their contract payment and filed their falsified monitoring reports and renewed. That stopped today. Mara nodded. What do you need from me this morning? Your statement. Formal, recorded. Everything from the moment you saw the transport come through the bay to the moment Torres picked you up in the alley. Voss paused. And then we need you available for the Oversight Committee's independent counsel when they convene the review. That's your testimony on record in an official proceeding. Another pause, after which you will have done significantly more than you were asked to do. When do we start the statement? Now, if you're ready. Mara pulled out a chair and sat down in front of the recording equipment that Garrett had quietly set up on the workstation table while they'd been talking. She folded her hands on the table, not clenched, not performing composure, just the neutral position of someone ready to speak accurately for as long as it took. Started at 6:04 a.m. She went for 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping. Formal statement was the easy part, functionally speaking easy, in the sense that it required only precision and memory, both of which she had. The harder parts were smaller and came afterward, in the gaps between the structured activities of a morning that moved very fast, once it started moving. Rusk arrived at the Federal Building at 9:02 a.m. She knew this because Voss texted it to her 3 words. He's in, while Mara was sitting in a side room, eating a breakfast sandwich that Torres had produced from somewhere, without being asked. The sandwich was turkey on something that might have been a roll, and it was not particularly good, and she ate all of it. Osterhaus was formally notified of the investigation's scope at 9:35 a.m., and Voss had been correct about the lawyer. The conflict of interest problem materialized at 10:12 a.m., which Mara knew because Garrett mentioned it with the same inflection he used for blood pressure readings. The Oversight Committee's independent counsel contacted Voss at 11:15 a.m. to confirm they'd received the documentation package and were convening an emergency session for the following morning. Ashworth's formal statement was recorded remotely at 2:30 p.m. Mara wasn't present for it, but Voss told her afterward that it had taken 3 hours, and that Ashworth had been precise and thorough and had only stopped once, briefly, when the questioning reached the period immediately before his transport to Harwich. 4:45 p.m., Meridian Logistics Group's 3 active federal contracts were formally suspended pending investigation. Mara saw it as a news service notification on her phone, not a headline yet, just an agency bulletin in the procurement database, the kind of thing that surfaced in industry feeds before it reached general reporting. She read it twice and put her phone face down on the table. 5:10 p.m., Voss told her she was free to go home. The van was gone. The duplex was clear. She could go home. She sat in the passenger seat of Torres's car for a moment before he started the engine. Looking at the operations building's unremarkable exterior. She was tired in the particular layered way that came after sustained high function, not exhausted but hollowed, the adrenaline structure that had been holding everything up for 4 days, quietly disassembling. "You okay?" Torres said. It was the third thing he'd ever said to her directly, and it caught her slightly off guard. "Working on it," she said. He nodded and started the car. The duplex was exactly as she'd left it. The coffee, she hadn't finished that. Morning had still on the counter, her legal pad on the kitchen table, open to the page she'd been on when Voss had called to tell her about the van. She stood in the kitchen for a while, without doing anything specific. Then she washed the coffee cup. Then she sat down at the table and closed the legal pad and put it in the drawer with the termination documentation. She slept for 11 hours. The next 3 weeks were a different kind of difficult, the procedural kind, the kind that required sustained attention without the clarity that danger provided. She testified before the Oversight Committee's independent counsel on a Thursday in a room in the federal building that was better lit and better furnished than the conference room where she'd first met Voss. And she went through the entire sequence again, with a different kind of precision, the legal kind, where every word was recorded and every qualification mattered. Osterhaus's attorney withdrew from representation on the 5th day of the investigation after the conflict of interest became formally documented. His replacement counsel entered a cooperation discussion with federal prosecutors. By the end of the 2nd week, not a guilty plea, not yet, but the opening of a negotiation that Voss described as moving with unusual speed, which in federal terms meant faster than years. Rusk's situation was different. He'd lawyered up immediately and said nothing in his first 2 interviews. But the payment records in Ashworth's partition were specific enough that silence wasn't a long-term strategy. By the end of the first week, there were reports not confirmed publicly, but present in the federal building's ambient information that filtered through Voss that Rusk was attempting to characterize his role as limited and peripheral, which was going to be a difficult position to sustain, given that his access code appeared in the communication records, in connection with Ashworth's clearance notification. 2 gray uniform medics from the transport were identified on the 9th day, private contractors with military backgrounds, employed through 3 layers of subcontracting that traced back to a Meridian operational support subsidiary. One of them had already contacted federal investigators independently. Voss mentioned this without elaboration, which meant the contact was ongoing and productive. Bonnie Skaggs gave her own statement on the 2nd day of the committee review. Mara wasn't present for it either, but she heard about it from Voss that Bonnie had been composed and detailed and had brought her personal drive and a printed index of its contents organized chronologically. The independent counsel had apparently found notably thorough. Mara was not surprised. On the 17th day, she received a certified letter from Harwick Military Medical Center's legal office. She read it standing at her kitchen counter, and then she put it down and made coffee and drank it and came back and read it again. The letter was an official notification that her termination was under formal review in light of the ongoing federal investigation, and that the facility's legal office had been directed to suspend all adverse employment actions related to the trauma Bay 2 incidents pending the outcome of the Oversight Committee proceedings. It was written in the particular careful language of institutions that had been advised by counsel to say the minimum necessary. And it said the minimum necessary, and what it said in the minimum necessary was that they were starting to understand they had made a mistake. She put the letter in the drawer on top of the termination documentation and the closed legal pad. On the 21st day, Voss called at 8:30 a.m. Meridian Logistics Group has filed for emergency contract reinstatement review, she said without preamble. Their legal team is arguing the suspension is procedurally premature. Will it hold? Mara said. No. But it creates a delay in the formal debarment process, which is what they want. More time for their lobbyists to work. Voss paused. There's something else. The committee review has expanded scope. They're now looking at Meridian's full contract portfolio across 4 agencies, not just the 2 operations Ashworth was investigating. When the scope expanded, some of the committee members who were, let's say, cautious about the investigation became significantly less cautious because the exposure got too big to manage quietly. Mara said. That's the optimistic reading. Voss paused again. The other reading is that 3 of the committee members who'd been receiving Meridian payments reached out to the independent counsel's office with unsolicited information about the payment structure before they were formally contacted. Another pause. People making decisions about their own futures. Mara thought about that. People making decisions. The whole architecture of the investigation, Ashworth running it for 7 months, Bonnie working from the outside for 8, the encrypted partitions, the dead drop. 37 lines. In an intake file that shouldn't have been there, all of it had been working toward the moment when staying in place became more dangerous than moving. One more thing, Voss said. Ashworth asked me to relay something, he said. She paused, and for the first time, Mara heard something in Voss's voice that she would have described cautiously as warmth. He said, tell her. The lung is at an 87%, and the doctors say it'll reach full function. And tell her that matters more than she probably thinks. Mara was quiet for a moment. Tell him I think it matters exactly as much as it should, she said. She ended the call. She stood in her kitchen for a moment in the morning light, which was thin and pale in the way of early winter, and she thought about 87% of a lung and about a records technician who'd shredded a letter and then kept going, and about the 8 case identifiers in a procedure protocol document, and about what it cost to build something like Meridian and what it cost to dismantle it. Then her phone buzzed again. Not Voss. A number she didn't recognize. She answered it. The voice was male, not measured and deliberate like the first unknown call, not official like Tate's. It was younger, rougher at the edges, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who didn't usually make this kind of call. I'm going to say this fast, the voice said, because I don't know how long this line is clean. I'm the second medic, the transport team. Mara said nothing. She was already reaching for a pen. I talked to the investigators on day 9, and I gave them everything on the vehicle registration and the communication chain and the operational orders. A pause. There's one thing I didn't tell them, because I didn't know if it was relevant. I know now it is. Another pause, shorter, more urgent. The sedative compound they used on Ashworth. I know where it was sourced. I know the physician who authorized the supply order. It wasn't Osterhaus, Mara said. Not a question. No, the voice said. It was someone higher. Someone who wasn't in any of the documentation because they made sure they weren't. A pause. There's a name missing from everything Ashworth built. Everything Bonnie pulled. A name that doesn't appear anywhere in the records because this person's spent 3 years making sure they were architecturally invisible. Mara's pen was on the paper. The name, she said. A brief silence. Dr. Vivienne Rail, the voice said. She's the chair of the Federal Procurement Oversight Committee. Pen stopped. The committee that was supposed to be investigating Meridian. Independent review that Voss had spent 3 weeks building toward. Proceeding in which Mara had testified, in which Bonnie had testified, in which Ashworth's 417 files were being evaluated. Chair. She's been coordinating with Meridian's executive layer for 4 years, the voice said. Not as a passive recipient, as an architect. The payment structure, the monitoring suppression, the committee member management, it ran through her. Osterhaus was a contractor. Rusk was a local facilitator. She was the mechanism that made all of it immune to oversight. Another pause. Because she was the oversight. Mara looked at the pen on the paper and the name she'd written. Why are you telling me? She said. Because I drove a dying man into a hospital where someone was waiting to make sure he didn't come out, the voice said. And I've been making decisions about what kind of person I am. He stopped. The investigators can verify everything I'm giving you. I have documentation. Physical, not digital. I kept physical copies because I didn't trust the digital chain. Where? He gave her an address. She wrote it. One more thing, he said. Rail knows the investigation expanded. She's been managing her position on the committee for 3 weeks, appearing cooperative, directing the review away from the supply chain authorization records that would surface her name. The Conde is, she's good at it. She's been doing it for 4 years. A pause. But she doesn't know about the physical documentation. Nobody does. I never told anyone I had it because I didn't know who was safe. You're telling me, Mara said. You were the only person in that hospital who moved, he said. I watched you. You didn't know who he was. You didn't know what he was carrying. You just moved. He stopped. I figured that probably meant you were safe. The line went quiet. Mara looked at the name on the paper. Dr. Vivienne Rael, the chair of the committee. The mechanism behind the mechanism, invisible by design, managing the investigation into herself from the inside, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 4 years being immune to consequences. Voss answered on the second ring. I need you to listen to something, Mara said. Voss listened without interrupting, which was how Mara knew it was serious. Voss interrupted when things were manageable. When she went quiet and stayed quiet, it meant she was recalculating from a foundation that had just shifted. When Mara finished, Voss said, say the name again. Dr. Vivienne Rael. A silence. Not hesitation processing. She chaired the session where your testimony was recorded. I know. She was in the room. I know. Another silence, this one longer, with a different texture. The physical documentation, you have an address. Yes. Don't go there alone, Voss said, and the speed at which she said it was itself a kind of answer, confirming that the address was real, that the second medic was credible, that the name was not a surprise so much as a dread that had been taking shape for days without fully forming. I need 2 hours. Don't contact anyone else. Don't tell anyone where you are. Voss. Mara said it carefully. How exposed is the committee review right now? Pause was 4 seconds. If Rael has been directing the review scope for 3 weeks, if she's been steering it away from the supply chain authorization chain, then the documentation we've submitted may have been evaluated by a process she controlled. Another pause. We need to get the physical documents in front of the independent counsel's office directly, outside the committee structure entirely. Can you do that? I'm going to make some calls that are going to make certain people very uncomfortable. Mara heard her check the time, 9:15 in the evening. A brief, grim pause that was the closest Voss came to dark humor. Good. She ended the call. Mara sat at her kitchen table with the name on the paper in front of her and thought about the architecture of it. 4 years. Rail had been building for 4 years, not just its accepting payments, but designing the system. Committee member management. The monitoring suppression. The way the investigation had been running for 3 weeks, with apparent momentum, while most critical authorization chain remained untouched. You didn't build that by being reactive. You built by understanding from the beginning exactly which pressure points needed to be controlled. Beshbor in controlling them before the pressure came. She was good at it. That was the part that sat in Mara's chest with the most weight. Not the corruption. Corruption was common enough to be almost structural, but the competence. The specific intelligence it took to be the mechanism behind 4 years of invisible harm and to position yourself as the instrument of accountability when the harm became visible. Mara thought about 8 case identifiers in a procedure protocol document. She thought about what competence in service of that looked like from the outside and what it required of the person doing it on the inside. And she thought, in the particular way she had, of following uncomfortable thoughts to their conclusions rather than stopping short, about what it meant that a system had been built specifically to survive scrutiny and that the survival depended entirely on no one outside, that system deciding individually and without institutional support that they were going to keep going anyway. A records technician with a personal drive and a shredded letter. A Navy commander who distributed his documentation before they sedated him. Transport medic who'd kept physical copies because he didn't trust the digital chain. A nurse who shouldn't have been in that bay. None of them had been positioned to do what they did. None of them had infrastructure or authorization or a clear line of safe passage through what they were walking into. They'd all just kept going through the version of it that was available to them, with the tools they actually had, which were never the right tools, and were always enough. She folded the paper with Rail's name on it and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she waited for Voss. Torres came alone at 11:30 p.m. with a location and a 2-sentence briefing. The physical documents had been retrieved from the address the medic had given, and Voss was already at the federal building with the independent counsel's deputy, who had driven 2 hours from Richmond after a phone call that Voss described only as productive. The federal building at midnight had a different quality than it did in daylight. Fewer people, harder light. The ambient sense of a space being used past its intended hours. For reasons that couldn't wait, Voss met Mara in the lobby with the specific energy of someone who had been running on compressed intensity for the past 3 hours and had found a sustainable frequency for it. "Ian, the physical documents are authenticated," she said, walking and talking simultaneously. "Handwritten authorization records Rail's signature on supply chain approvals that don't appear anywhere in the digital record because they were never entered. Kept the paper trail off the system deliberately." The medic understood what he had. "Where is she now?" Mara said. "Her residence. Under watch as of 40 minutes ago." Voss pushed through a door and into a corridor. "She doesn't know yet. She's going to know at approximately 7 a.m. when federal agents knock on her door, but right now she thinks she's still managing a review process that's going to produce findings she's already drafted." Mara thought about that Rail at her residence, possibly asleep, operating on the assumption that the architecture she'd built was still standing. There was something almost disorienting about it. The moment before everything changed, indistinguishable from every other moment. The deputy independent counsel was a woman named Adeze Okoye, late 40s. Calm authority of someone who had spent a career in rooms powerful where powerful people were held accountable and had found it neither surprising nor satisfying, just necessary. She shook Mara's hand with a grip that was brief and direct, and then she sat down and opened a folder and said to Maddox, "Walk me through the second medic's call. Verbatim, as close as you can get." Mara walked her through it. Okoye took 12 pages of notes. She asked 6 questions, all of them precise, none of them leading. At the end, she closed the folder and looked at Mara with an expression that was professional rather than personal, but that contained, underneath the professional surface, something that Mara read as the specific weight of encountering evidence that confirmed the worst version of what you'd suspected. "Committee review is suspended as of tonight," Okoye said. "The findings Rail's office was preparing are frozen. We'll be conducting our own independent document review beginning tomorrow morning, outside the committee structure, with an oversight panel drawn from agencies that have no prior relationship with Meridian's contract portfolio." She paused. "That process will take time, months, realistically. But the suspension is immediate, and the scope is total." "The other 7 case identifiers," Mara said. "The patients in the procedure protocol beyond Ashworth." Okoye looked at her steadily. "That investigation begins tomorrow as well, with whatever medical expertise we can assemble." She paused. "We may need people with specific clinical knowledge of the implant procedure to assist with patient identification, and depending on what we find, intervention protocols." The room was quiet for a moment. "I know someone," Mara said. The morning Rail was arrested, Mara was in the operations building watching it happen, on a news feed that someone had pulled up on one of the wall monitors. Not because she needed to see it, she didn't need confirmation, didn't need the visual, but because 4 years of invisible architecture deserved to become visible, and she thought she owed it to the 8 case identifiers to be paying attention at the moment it did. The footage was exterior, a federal building in D.C., dark sedans, the specific choreography of an early morning federal arrest that looks almost administrative until you registered what it meant. Rail appeared for approximately 4 seconds in the frame. In a dark coat, her face carrying the expression of someone who had calculated probabilities for 4 years and had finally encountered one she hadn't adequately weighted. She looked, in those 4 seconds, like a person who understood exactly what had happened and couldn't believe it had. Garrett was at his workstation. He noted the timestamp without inflection. Mara looked at the monitor for another moment, and then looked away and drank her coffee, which had gone lukewarm, which was how it usually went. 2 days later, the Oversight Committee announced the suspension of Meridian Logistics Group's entire federal contract portfolio, not just the 2 operational contracts that had been suspended earlier, but all 17 active contracts across 4 agencies, totaling a figure that the procurement bulletin listed in a way that required reading twice. The announcement was covered by 3 trade publications and, by the following morning, by 2 major outlets whose defense and contracting reporters had clearly been working the story from the edges for some time and now had enough to go public. Public story was narrower than the full story it always was, but it was accurate in the specific way that mattered. It named the mechanism: supply chain fraud, falsified monitoring, a systematic suppression of oversight that had been running for 4 years under the protection of a compromised committee chair. Meridian's name, Rail's name, the federal investigation, the contracts. It did not name Mara. It did not name Bonnie. It did not name the second medic, whose cooperation was still part of an ongoing proceeding. It named Osterhaus in a single paragraph as a physician under investigation in connection with the supply chain fraud, a characterization that was legally careful and clinically devastating, the 2 things being different sides of the same surface. Rusk's name appeared in the 3rd article, in the 4th paragraph, as the facility director of a hospital whose administrative chain was under review. The same construction, careful, devastating. Mara read the articles at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with actual coffee, hot this time, and felt the particular exhaustion of a thing that had been held at high tension for a long time, finally going slack. Not relief, exactly relief. Implied the fear had been the main thing, and the fear hadn't been the main thing. The main thing had been the work, and the work was mostly done, and what she felt was specific tired that came after. Called Bonnie that afternoon. Not for any operational reason, just to call. Bonnie answered on the second rings and said, "I saw the articles," and then was quiet for a moment. And Mara heard in that quiet the 8 months of a personal drive and a shredded letter, and 30 times sharing vending machine coffee on the night shift. "You did good work," Mara said again. "So did you?" Bonnie said. "You did it first." A pause. 8 years ago, when you filed the complaint, that was the first time someone pulled on this thread. They buried it, but it didn't go away. It's still what they were covering up when I found the access log anomaly. She paused again. "I've been thinking about that. About how long a thing can stay buried and still eventually surface. Long enough to feel like it won't," Mara said. "Yes," Bonnie said. "Exactly that long." The formal review of Mara's termination took 11 days once the Oversight Committee's independent panel submitted its preliminary findings. The findings included a specific section on Harwick Military Medical Center's administrative actions in the 48 hours following Ashworth's intake, the decision to suspend and then terminate Mara, the documentation constructed around the breach narrative, and the evidence that Rusk's office had communicated with Meridian-connected parties during that period. The section was 3 pages. It was in the specific language of official findings. Damning. Patricia Holst called Mara. On the morning the findings went to Harwick's board. She called on a personal number, not through the facility's administrative line, which told Mara everything about the nature of the call before it began. "I want to say something that isn't coming from legal," Holst said. "Just from me." "Okay," Mara said. "I knew." Holst said it flatly, without qualification. "Not what Rusk was connected to. I didn't know that. But I knew when I walked into that conference room that what we were doing to you wasn't right. And I did it anyway because She stopped. "I told myself I was protecting the facility. What I told myself." Mara was quiet. "I don't expect that to change anything," Holst said. Wanted to say it directly, without lawyers in the room. Mara thought about it for a moment, the thing it cost to make that call, the thing it had cost to not make it earlier, the gap between those 2 things and what lived in it. "Appreciate you saying it," Mara said. And she meant it, which surprised her somewhat, Not because she'd forgiven it. Forgiveness was a separate process with its own timeline, but because the honesty had value regardless of its timing. The formal reinstatement offer arrived the following week. It was delivered by courier in a sealed envelope from Harwick's board, and it was comprehensive, full reinstatement, retroactive compensation for the period of termination, formal written apology from the facility signed by the acting director, who had replaced Rusk's, and an offer of her previous position, or, at her election, a senior clinical role with expanded authority. Mara read it at the kitchen table. Then she put it in the drawer. She took it out again the next morning and read it a second time, because she'd learned not to make decisions in the first hour of having information. Second section clarified what she'd known at the first reading, but hadn't wanted to confirm immediately. She didn't want to go back. Not to that ward, not to that building, not to the version of herself that had been operating in that role, skilled, committed, and systematically positioned where none of those things could be used at their full extent. She wrote a response that was courteous and specific. She declined the reinstatement. She declined the senior clinical role. She thanked the board for the formal apology, which she meant, and she said she was available to assist with any clinical review connected to the ongoing investigation, which she also meant. She sent it and made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about what came next. What came next arrived in the form of a phone call from a colonel she hadn't spoken to before, not Tate, a different voice, with the identifier of the Army Medical Department's training directorate, who had apparently received her name through a channel that, when she asked, he described only as multiple directions simultaneously. We're restructuring the forward medical training curriculum, he said, specifically the combat trauma assessment protocols for teams operating in environments where standard diagnostic infrastructure isn't available. We've been looking for someone with both field experience and current clinical practice to help develop the assessment framework. A pause. Your name keeps coming up. In what context? Mara said. In the context of someone who identified a tension pneumothorax complicated by a pre-existing implant-induced pleural compromise in under 2 minutes in a non-clinical environment, without imaging, and was right. Another pause. That's the kind of pattern recognition we're trying to build into the curriculum. The skill exists. Teaching it systematically is the problem we haven't solved. Mara was quiet for a moment. She looked out the kitchen window at the backyard of the duplex, which contained a small square of dead November grass and a bird feeder she'd never filled. What would the role involve? She said. He told her. It was not a small thing: curriculum development, scenario design, direct instruction with medical teams at 3 training installations, and periodic deployment to forward assessment exercises. It would require her to be a lot of places she hadn't planned to be. It would require her to carry everything she'd been trained to carry and to pass it to people who needed it before they found out they needed it. It would require her to stop pretending that what she was and what she did were separate things. When do you need an answer? She said. When you're ready to give one, he said. She gave it 2 days. She spent the first day running and cleaning things that didn't need cleaning and reading half a book she'd been working through for 3 weeks. She spent the second day sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh legal pad and writing out the reasons for and against in 2 columns, which was a system she used when she trusted her reasoning less than she needed to. The against column had practical objections: instability, relocation, the particular wear of living in training environments. The for column had one thing written at the top and then a long space below it. The one thing was because the next person in that bay deserves a team that moves. Called the colonel on the morning of the 3rd day. Yes, she said. She saw Darian Ashworth one more time before she left Harwick, in a neutral location, a diner 2 blocks from the federal building that served coffee that was bad in the honest, unpretentious way of diners that had been making bad coffee for 40 years and saw no reason to change. He was out of the medical facility and moving carefully, but moving, and he looked better than he had at Millhaven, color in his face. the effortful alertness, replaced by something more natural. Though there was still a quality of restrained movement that said the left lung was working, but hadn't forgotten what it had been through. He was already there when she arrived, which she appreciated. She didn't like waiting in diners alone. They ordered coffee, and he ordered a piece of pie that he ate about half of. She didn't order anything else, and he didn't comment on it. Rael entered a plea, he said. It had happened 2 days before. Mara knew, but she let him say it. Cooperation agreement. She's giving names that go above her in the Meridian executive structure, which, he paused. I didn't know there was an above her. Thought she was the ceiling. There's always a ceiling above the ceiling, Mara said. Apparently. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The identification process for the other patients is going. 3 of the 8 have been located and evaluated. 2 of them have devices that are still structurally intact, no blast exposure, no activation. They're being referred for surgical removal. He said it with the flatness of someone who had processed the horror of it and arrived at the factual layer. The other 5 too didn't survive their respective incidents. The remaining 3 are ongoing. Mara nodded. She'd been briefed separately. Knowing didn't make the nodding easy. The medic, he said. Carver, that's his name. He's been cooperative enough that the prosecutors are recommending a reduced charge. He'll do time, but not, he paused. Not the kind of time you do when there's no cooperation on the record. He made a decision, Mara said. He made the right one late, Ashworth said. But he made it. She looked at him at the scar from his temple to the corner of his mouth, old and pale, the one that had nothing to do with any of this and that she'd noticed on the gurney before she knew anything else about him. She'd been looking at someone's face, reading what it told her, making a decision in under 2 minutes. That was the whole thing, really. That was the only thing she'd done that night that mattered. I heard you took the training role, he said. Word travels. Voss mentioned it. He looked at his coffee. It's the right call. You know that. I'm getting there, she said, which was honest. She was getting there. The certainty was building, but it wasn't complete yet, and she'd stopped pretending certainty was complete before it was. Can I ask you something, he said. Yes. 8 years ago. When you filed the complaint and it went nowhere, when they classified it and renewed the contract and separated you from service. He looked at her directly. How did you keep going? Mara thought about it. She gave it the time it deserved, which was more than a reflexive answer would take. I didn't for a while, she said. I got a nursing job in a city where nobody knew me, and I did the work, and I told myself the work was enough. And for a while it was, because it is the work is genuinely enough, most days. You save the person in front of you, and that matters, regardless of everything else. She paused. The other thing, the bigger thing, I didn't touch it for years, because touching it meant admitting I hadn't actually finished it, that it was still there. She looked at her coffee cup, and then a man came through a bay with the wrong color at his mouth, and nobody was moving. And it turned out the thing I hadn't finished was the same thing. Ashworth was quiet. I don't think that's a tidy lesson, she said. I don't think the takeaway is that everything connects eventually, or that persistence is always rewarded. Sometimes the buried thing stays buried. Sometimes the complaint stays classified. She paused. But I think you don't get to know which kind you're in while you're in it. So you just keep doing the work in front of you, and you keep your notes, and you keep your eyes open. He nodded slowly. He understood it. She could see that. Not because it was a clean answer, but because it was a true one, which were different standards. The lung is at 91%, he said. I heard 87. That was last week. He almost smiled. Apparently, I'm an overachiever. She did smile at that. It was small and it was real. Finished their coffee. She paid for both, and he didn't argue, which she appreciated for reasons she didn't examine. Outside the diner, on the sidewalk, in the flat gray of a December morning, they shook hands, the way two people shook hands when the thing they'd been through together didn't have a conventional social form. And a handshake was the closest available approximation. Take care of the lung, she said. Take care of the next bay, he said. She walked to her car. He walked in the other direction. She left Harwick on a Friday morning with her car loaded and her duplex keys returned to the landlord and the bird feeder, finally filled 2 days before she left inexplicably, impractically, a decision she couldn't entirely justify, left for whoever came next. The drive to the first training installation was 6 hours. Stopped once for gas and once for coffee that was worse than the diners, which she hadn't thought was possible. And she drank it anyway and drove with the radio on low and the particular sensation of forward motion that was different from running away, even though the physical experience of driving away from a place was identical either way. The difference was internal, the direction of the attention, whether it was pointed toward what was being left or toward what was being approached. She was pointed forward, mostly. There were moments crossing the state line, seeing the Harwick Water Tower shrink in the rear view, where she was pointed at both simultaneously, which was probably honest. She thought about what she was carrying to the next thing. Not the credentials, those were straightforward, but the accumulated specific knowledge of what it looked like when a system failed a person deliberately from the inside, using the instruments of care as the mechanism of harm. She knew what that looked like in a chart, in a trauma bay, in a conference room at 6 a.m. She knew what it felt like to be in the path of it and to move anyway. And she knew what it cost. And she knew that the cost was real and not something to minimize by calling it worth it in a way that erased the actual weight. It was worth it. And it cost something, both true. What she was going to do in rooms full of people who were going to go into environments where the difference between moving and not moving was the difference between a life and a loss, was teach them the thing you couldn't fully teach in a classroom. She was going to do it anyway, imperfectly, with real scenarios and honest failure rates, and the kind of instruction that didn't protect students from the difficulty, because the difficulty was the point. She was going to teach them to see what needed to be seen and to move when movement was required, regardless of who was standing in the doorway saying, "Wait." She was going to be honest with them about what that cost, and she was going to teach it anyway, because the alternative was people in bays with wrong color lips and teams that stood still. She was going to teach them that the protocol exists to protect the patient, and when the protocol stops doing that, your job is the patient and you do your job. She was going to teach them that being dismissed is data, not a verdict that the person who underestimates you has told you something about their own limits, not yours. That silence in the face of a failing system isn't professionalism, it's participation. That you can be methodical and still be fast, careful, and still be first, afraid, and still move. She was going to teach them everything she'd learned in the spaces where she hadn't been trusted, because those spaces had been better classrooms than any installation she was driving toward. She was going to do all of it imperfectly, because she was still learning too. And anyone who told you they'd finished learning was someone to be careful of. The road opened into a flat stretch of Virginia farmland, winter bare and wide, and the morning light came in flat and pale across the windshield in a way that was almost warm. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at it at a red light. Text from Bonnie, first day of the new job. Records technician, Inspector General's office, Procurement Oversight Division. A pause in the message thread, then figured I'd stay close to the problem. Mara read it twice and laughed, actually laughed, short and real, the kind that came out before you decided whether to let it. Type back, perfect placement. Then, after a second, let me know what you find. The light turned green. She put the phone down and drove. She had 6 hours and a new thing to build, and the specific, imperfect, costly, necessary knowledge of what happened when someone in the right position decided to move. She drove forward and didn't look back, which was not because the past was resolved. It wasn't entirely, and wouldn't be for some time. Maybe always in some form, but because the road was there, and the work was there, and the people she was going to stand in front of and say, "This is what I know. Let me show you we're there." Turned the radio up. The farmland flattened and opened ahead of her, gray and wide and going somewhere. She went,